Welcome to Time Monk Radio Network. I'm Gemini, and today is Saturday, July 28th, 2012. Neil Kramer joins us this evening. You can learn more about Neil at neilkramer.com. Instead of listing all of the amazing things that Neil does, I will sum up Neil for you in one sentence. Neil is one of the coolest blokes that we have had the pleasure of speaking with, and we are happy to have him here again. Hello, Neil. Welcome back to Time Monk Radio.
Welcome. Yes, thank you. It's good to be here. Thanks for that lovely introduction.
You're quite welcome. Several members of the Time Monk Forum are with us this evening. Please welcome members Uranus Rising, Lennie, Green Meadow, and Chipper Dog. Neil, you've been really busy since we spoke with you in September of last year.
I have indeed. I have been writing a book, which is out now, and I have been spending my time traveling around, speaking to people and doing all kinds of different things. But essentially, yeah, I was completing the book project, which is called The Unfoldment, which came out in May. And it's just been out a little over sort of 6 or 7 weeks now. And yeah, it's good to see a physical object out there. You know, so much of what we do these days is digital and electronic and PDFs and blogs and so on. It's kind of nice to see a chunk of paper in your hand.
Yes. Well, I certainly enjoyed your book. And let's start by delving into some of those topics that are in the unfoldment. And one of the things that is of real interest to all of us is living with a foot in two worlds. And you touched a little bit about that in your book, Mystic in the Marketplace, cognitive dissonance, and that kind of stuff, if you don't mind starting there.
Sure. Well, I think because of the kind of fantastic nature of a lot of the things that you guys and me and my friends and our peers in the alternative or esoteric or conspiratorial community, whatever you want to call it, all those amazing things kind of stay on the page unless we actually do something about them. They stay on the screen, they stay on our iPods or whatever. So it's become increasingly important in my work to measure the relevance of a piece of knowledge by how one can apply it in real life. And if it can't be applied, then it can remain as a really fascinating piece of knowledge, but I personally would question its immediate relevance. You know, I just put it in a little file, as it were, in the mind and keep it there, but it doesn't really get referenced very often. What we can actually apply is not just what's sort of selfishly and personally applicable, but what is resonant with where we're at consciously. So it's not just about the stuff that you like and the stuff that's easy to do. Some of the things that I integrate into my life and I teach others to integrate into their lives are very complex and very hard to do, but worth it. It's more to do with what is resonant at any particular moment, and particularly living in the unusual, surreal landscape of 21st century America and Europe, where I guess most of you guys are from, and most of the listeners are from, and of course others further afield. But that particular environment is so odd and is so opposed to the mystical path, the spiritual path, that you have to sort of stand back and really just laugh at it in a way and just think, this is such a stark contrast. It's almost unbelievable. It's almost incredible in the true sense of the word. And I think there's kind of like a clue in that to say that the beauty and the exquisiteness of the inner journey is such a funny thing to see against the backdrop of what happens in Los Angeles and New York and London and Paris and, you know, the mainstream splurge and the mainstream effort of corporatism and control and all those silly things. It's such a funny backdrop to have it there that I think there's kind of a clue in that to say, well, to some degree, it's like that for a reason. And one of the exercises, I think, in coming here to Earth as a human being, one of the training exercises is to say, well, if you can fit your spiritual shape, as it were, into this scenario, into this paradigm, then you're going to learn a very important thing, which is that unless you can modify and adapt your spiritual frequency, your ability to control your mind, your body, your emotions, your intellect, unless you can fit those things to a diverse range of environments, it's actually quite a fragile thing. So we can all probably go and wander off into the mountains or in a cave or a monastery or a temple and find a certain serenity and a certain peace and a certain balance, which is great. But as anyone who's done that will know, the big problem with that is that as soon as you come away from that environment, that space that you've set up begins to diminish until finally, you kind of go back to, as it were, the real world, and everything just, goes back to this mainstream overriding frequency of chaos, really. So I think it's very important to be able to create an inner strength, an inner balance, and take that everywhere with you, as you say, into the marketplace, being the fundamentally craziest place where you could do it, whether that's, the hallowed corridors of bloody Walmart, or whether it's Times Square, or whether it's, some sort of Moroccan bazaar. It's all the same thing. You've got this tremendous chaotic human energy, and you've got good people and weird people and old and young and black and white and all this huge sort of array of humanity. And if you can carry yourself in that place and you can maintain your integrity as a naturally ascendant human soul, then you're doing something really amazing. You're cultivating this spiritual vessel in a very amazing way. And as you do it, you're kind of compelled to learn all kinds of tricks and techniques and functions of the mind and the spirit that allow that to happen. So shielding, for example, is something that's very often talked about in New Age books. I totally do the opposite of that. I think shielding oneself, creating this bubble around you or whatever, takes so much energy up that it has the kind of comical reverse effect of depleting your psychic or mental charge so much that you actually create more problems than you solve. So one of the techniques that I show is being able to take external vibrations in, external energy, external vibes, attitudes, perspectives, whatever you want to call it, just words even, and then letting them flow straight out again. So the hollow reed or the hollow vessel, being able to recognize an energy passing into your system, but not immediately pouncing on it to analyze it and process it. Because when we do that, it's like being in the room with a very negative person or a very angry person. You cannot help but absorb some of that. But if you then begin to process it, thinking, well, why are they angry? What's wrong with that? Is it me? Is it something else? Maybe they shouldn't act like that, and I would never do that. So why, when you do that stuff, it takes a tremendous amount of energy. And if you times that by, hundreds of thousands of people, then going into a city with a very rigorous pattern of who you are, which is inflexible, is going to fundamentally damage any balance that you attain. Not irreparably, but to an extent where it's going to take you days to recover. So I've seen many people go to like silent retreats in the States and in Europe and Italy, France, England, come away, and literally the day after they leave the place, they're in a worse state than before they left for the retreat. And you have to think, well, what are you doing that for? Is it like a spiritual vacation? Is it spiritual Las Vegas, where you pull the silver arm and watch the wheels spin and, fingers crossed that something juicy and brilliant will come up and you'll get some magic upgrade. So all that going away to do something special, in my perspective, in my book, The Unfoldment, that all goes away. You have to bring the macro into the micro. You have to be able to fit the big mysteries of the universe into the little mysteries of your own domestic affairs and your own life and your own relationships. So it's so important to be able to integrate practically and be able to do all that stuff, because otherwise you're missing out. If you try and just escape, you kind of, you're not attending the classroom, you're checking out, you're forfeiting the spiritual course that you've set upon. You've like paid 30 grand to go to the spiritual university, and then on the second day you think, oh, this is too weird and hard, forget it, I'll just wander around and not bother. There's no point in doing that. We volunteered, in my view, to come to this and to get spiritual training and to clarify our divine exploration and to repair parts of the universe that need help. And it's like a big reciprocal energy exchange. It's really fascinating and really interesting. And all our spiritual ancestors have, put a lot of time and energy and made tremendous efforts to describe what this is about. So to portion little bits of that off and say, well, when I'm spiritual, I go to this place. Or when I'm spiritual, I wear this particular purple T-shirt, is understandable, and perhaps it's in the initial stages permissible. But as we mature in our consciousness, as we move forward, that stuff has to go. You have to be able to do it anywhere, anytime.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, making that a daily practice and incorporating it into your every moment.
Yeah, every moment, everything that you do, it's 24/7. So much so that it becomes really a pleasure. It's not like a big effort. You think, oh God, being vigilant 24/7, that sounds like a lot of hard work. Not really. It's like the eagle who sits on a tree stump. He's always looking around. He's always super vigilant. It's just part of the nature. It's become part of his nature. It's become part of how that conscious entity operates. And it's kind of like a game. It's kind of pleasurable. And, you're running that program of perception all the time. But as you get better at it, it requires less battery, as it were, as if it's like an app on your smartphone or something. It requires less and less until eventually it becomes totally effortless. There's no resistance. And everything that comes toward you in life is an opportunity for growth and for engagement and for creativity. Not in some white robe wearing, boring way, but in a really vivid, interesting, juicy way, where everything that you do when you're walking down the street, or you're talking to your mother, or you're, waiting in the dentist's waiting room, all those things are rich with possibilities.
Hi, Neil. This is Green Meadow, and I've been noticing that the universe is not seeming to allow retreat in the same way. That it's not like even the Tibetan monks got kicked out, that people can't retreat to a monastery, or they're having that. They go away for the spiritual quiet weekend and they come back and they have whiplash. So I'm seeing, it seems like universe is calling for us to be the mystic in the marketplace. But it's...
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm feeling like the changing of frequencies. It's like going from... I can have in my home a peaceful space, and I go to work and there may be chaos at work, and the switching back and forth from the different spaces can get very tiring sometimes. It's like it costs energy to switch spaces like that.
Well, therein lies the discipline and the practice. It's like for many, many years I did karate, Shotokan karate. And for years, to stand in certain postures for 5, 10, 15 minutes without moving, which was part of the training, was just tremendously difficult. And to the point where, like, every few weeks you're kind of thinking, shall I come to karate next week? Because it's kind of not fun. And it's kind of draining me, really. And switching between moving around and doing normal stuff and walking down the street, driving a car. Funny environment where you are forcing your energy in a certain mold, in a certain shape, was strange. And it takes time for our energy configuration to be able to make that adaptation smoothly. And as you say, initially, I think it's quite difficult. The way I think about it, which I think is helpful, is that this peaceful, powerful space that we want to create in our lives and hold is actually more akin to an attitude or a perspective. It's not anything that requires any special energy as such. It's a certain approach. It's a certain angle on looking at something. And when you hit that angle, it starts to, there's like a if you think of it in this way, there's a certain geometry to it. There's a certain sweeping arc to it, where it's not that stark 90-degree right angle anymore. It's not that right turn at the junction in the road. It's an arc, and as you realize that the whole thing is in these circles, as in martial arts, in Aikido, it's all about circles. Less energy is expended in changing from point A to point B, or state A to state B. Less energy is expended, and you don't throw a switch anymore on and off. You turn a dial, and you turn the dial from, say, 0 to 10, and there are increments in between. So to go from 0 to 10 is a bit of a leap. If you were just to yank that dial across, that takes a lot of energy. But if you smoothly turn that dial and see it as an analog thing, like the old-fashioned, amplifiers or for guitars, or the old-fashioned stereos at home, if you see that as an analog thing, not as a digital switch, but as a dial with incremental gradations along the way, then we begin to suggest to consciousness that there's a smoother switching, if you like, if you want to use that word. There's a smoother switching from one state to another. And it's just in the same way that you may go to a retreat center or a spiritual conference, or any sort of conference where you're going to focus intelligence on something substantial, let's say, or something unusual to the mainstream. Have a couple of days afterwards where there's nothing, where you leave the place, but you're not going home. You're not going into a alien environment. You create a sort of departure lounge. You create a gradation point on that scale. So when I work with people face-to-face on a one-to-one basis, which I do frequently, if that person is spending a few days with me, then I often suggest that after that, they create a couple of days for themselves. They don't go home to their friends or family or apartment straight away. If they've got the resource and luxury of time, which many people are certainly creating a lot more time for themselves these days, let's put it that way. If you can create that space, then you're recognizing and you're saying to consciousness, okay, you're going to need a little bit of time to reshape into a different pattern. And if I do that too harshly, you're going to run out of juice. So let's spend a little bit of time doing that over a couple of days. So I think that's the secret, that these things, like any gardener will tell you, good gardening takes time. You can't just put things under lamps and just put artificial, boosters of water or whatever. It kind of doesn't work, and the growth isn't quite the same. Growth and real blossoming, just as a petal, as consciousness, whatever, it takes time. And that's the key, that if we create lives for ourselves where we don't permit ourselves a lot of time, and we're always rushing about from one thing to another, you create an inherent problem, which is you're not giving consciousness the time to make arc movements. It's making right angle turns necessarily, but that's very depleting. So real wealth, and wealthy people in monetary terms will always echo this, real wealth is time, is having free time to do what you want with. That is wealth. And on the spiritual path, that sort of wealth becomes more significant in a way. And you gladly exchange material and financial resources to create that space where you can make more of that time.
Yeah, as you talk, it makes me think about how I've started to use my day, because if max spiritual is 10 and max, marketplace is 0, I don't spend my time at 10, or I don't spend my time at 0. I'll go to 8, and then I'll go to 5, and then I'll go to 6, and to 2. I'll go back and forth throughout my day between the meditative and the marketplace, instead of trying to stay in one place all day. And that does seem to be working. Yeah,
and I think that's a smart way of looking at it. I mean, this this model we're talking about with this dial and the numbers on it, it's a way of thinking, of course. We're not being literal, but it's a way of thinking, and it shows the mind another way of organizing thought and processing and analysis. But ultimately, if you take a step out of this and don't see it purely as an abstract mental problem, but as a pure energetic problem, as a spiritual issue, we have to recognize that what goes on in the silence on top of a mountain and what goes on in the hubbub of the marketplace is the same thing. One isn't better or different in any way, really, than the other. What's different is the complexity and the shape of the consciousness in those places. And if we are actively growing our consciousness, as we stretch it out, we increase our ability to perceive. And many people who take it upon themselves to develop selfhood and then transcend selfhood, which is really the secret of the mystical journey, those two stages. Anyone who's doing that, as they begin to focus their attention on it, will notice a definite increase in their sensitivity generally to the world. And for many people, that can be very challenging, to say the least. And if that's the case, you have to learn to manage that sensitivity, not just to shut yourself away. That isn't managing it, really. That's a short-term kind of crisis management option, you know. That's the point of doing this, to say, well, if you're going to develop this extraordinary sensitivity, and let us even say, this psychic ability to look into the world in a deeper way, to see around the corner, to look above the wall and see what some people can't see, then you are going to have to learn how to control that. And so you step up one step at a time. You don't suddenly jump to that like, the X-Men in a movie or something. It's something that you have to walk towards in a certain measured manner. So by the time you reach it, you have learned all the appropriate lessons by the time you take that ability truly into your own hands. And you say, I understand this now. I understand the sensitivity, the penetration. I understand the effect it has on other people. I also appreciate when it's appropriate to use that insight and when it isn't. And when it's okay just to sit back, eat a steak, watch a movie, have a glass of wine, laugh and joke with your friends about politics and nonsense, and just be stupid and carefree and not go into matters of substance. It's appropriate to do that, just to mess around sometimes, to play. If you can't build play into your spiritual growth, you're missing out. You're missing out on something. So
I was just going to say, Neil, isn't that a matter of substance? Play? Learning that play? Isn't that a big matter of substance?
That's very ironic. Yes, it is. The actual thing, the idea itself, the concept of play being an important growth potential is a very substantial thing to contemplate. But when you're in it, you look at children playing or dogs playing, and you'll see that there's no tremendous substance there to them. Philosophically to us, in a world that forbids play for adults outside of mainstream accepted conduits for that, and it is a hugely substantial topic to us. But when you're in it, it's the easiest thing in the world. Substantial, insubstantial doesn't come into it. It's just consciousness, creativity, flow in a very pure state of being with, a lot of smiles, a lot of humor. Those are the markers for this.
Thanks.
And I had another question about living in two worlds. It's as you look more at the advertised version of reality, and then you have, as you study more, there's things like the Federal Reserve isn't federal and is actually a private bank, and then you have people telling you you should be investing in your 401ks. So it's cognitive dissonance with material reality, and so almost a foot in two worlds in that aspect as well.
Mm-hmm.
So and is that just a test for holding your own individuality, you're holding your own thoughts, or?
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying now. if you go into a space where in a world on a planet where everything is super cool and everyone is supremely balanced, then it's a place of rest and it's a place of repose. And there are worlds like that, thank goodness. And that's great. This isn't one of those worlds. This is a world of extreme polarization. And if you, even in Christian scripture, if you read it Kabbalistically or mystically, as it were, if you go to books like the Zohar, this Jewish text that will say, here's a different way of looking at the first few books of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, they recognize that polarization is like an engine to have light and dark and hard and soft and push and pull. It's like an engine, and everything that pings around between those two forces, the negative and the positive attractors, it accelerates growth. So to see the stupidity and lies of America and Britain, in particular at the moment, the two worst offenders in my view, particularly Britain actually, I think what the difference between the two is America's offending of human consciousness is quite transparent. At least they're honest about it in a way. British insidiousness and British creepiness and craftiness is so ugly and awful that it just leaves a really bad taste in the mouth. At least putting George Bush in the president's chair, you know, you're putting your cards on the table when you do that, aren't you? You're not really pretending anymore. You're saying, look, there isn't really a president, really. Look at this guy, you know? It's a figurehead for a cabal of other people, and we're not even trying to hide it anymore. In Britain, they're still trying to hide it. They're still being bizarre about it. So that's a funny thing. You question, though, what about that? Going to those polarities in their depths, like the most exciting, sublime, transcendental experiences that I can think of that have happened to me in the last few months, contrasting those with moments of real darkness and shadow and disgust and fear and disappointment. As a human being, I embrace all those things fully. I don't try and hide them. I don't try and destroy them. I embrace all of it. If you shy away from the negativity, then you're missing out on half of life. If you only cleave and cling to the positive, you're missing out on half of life. And so the point is, and there's again, this is a mystical view from the 15th and 16th centuries, when European mystics questioned the role of evil in the world, and I use that word advisedly, they very quickly came to the conclusion, reading their source texts from 500, 1,000, 2,000 years before then, that evil is an obedient servant of the divine. So evil is as important to the creative dynamic in this universe as are the trees, as is the sun, as is beauty, as is Christ, as is Buddha, as is whatever. It's a very important piece on the game board. It's a very important thing. And ultimately it's playing a really bizarre, fascinating, odd, exciting, thrilling role. And it's as if up there in the high chairs of seventh dimensional ascendancy, somebody goes, right, I'll tell you what, I'll play evil. I'll be the satanic force. I'll be the little devil who goes into the system and kind of spoils everything all the time. I'll play that role. And I'll play it for 16 billion years. And then I'll tell you what, I want some major paid leave after that, right? And I want to put my feet up and have 12 trillion years off. Is it a deal? Yeah, it's a deal, right? You go in, play Satan, and speed everything up. And at the same time as creating this engine of dynamic potentiality, you're also serving to show people, how do you reconcile dark and light? How do you reconcile conscious and unconscious? Is unconsciousness a bad thing? No, not really. Is consciousness a good thing? From a higher level, no, not really. So when you start to look at the value of those things, of right and wrong and good and evil, as a person, we naturally gravitate to good and right, and we stay away from wrong and unconscious, whatever. But as you zoom out, the value of those things changes. As you get out of being Green Meadow or Lennie or Neil Kramer or whoever, the value of those things radically changes until you realize that everything, as Nietzsche put it, is beyond good and evil. It doesn't really work like that. And you have to then say, well, what does that mean for living as a man or a woman? What does that mean in my daily life? Am I to do both things at once? Am I to not try to judge anything? Am I trying to create a new value system for everything? You know, it puts a big question mark over a lot of things that it would be far easier just to say, look, there are good guys and bad guys. I'm with the good guys and we're fighting for a better world. That would be great. That would be so easy and so clear cut. But it's much more exciting and interesting than that. It's not as simple as that. That is a starting point, and there are tens of thousands of our troops, of our soldiers, who feel that way and are out around the world doing things like that. And to some degree, we can, hand on heart, thank them for their service, as you American guys often like to say, because in their paradigm, that is something to be grateful for, to think, well, you feel that that's what you're doing, and in some sense, at a low level, that's correct. And I can accept and acknowledge that, and I could thank somebody for their service if they were doing that for the country, for the people. As they develop in their unfoldment, as they gain truer refinement, they couldn't do that anymore. They would stop and they would come away from it. And a few more lifetimes, they would never do something like that ever again. Not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't achieve what they thought it was achieving. Just in the same way that if I was an investment banker and then at 50 I had a heart attack, sat in hospital for 3 weeks and thought, you know what, I don't want to do that anymore. That isn't a true way of being for me. It was once, it was the best I could do, and it was what I thought was right. And so it doesn't make it wrong all of a sudden, but it makes it not appropriate anymore. So without the extreme contrast, without polarity, it would take an eternity to learn this stuff. So polarity is there to bump up against and then come away from and contemplate what that means. And as long as you can create this inner strength inside, then it's not as depleting. And you also begin to realize, more importantly, that the roller coaster of having a good day, then a bad day, then a good day, then 3 bad days, then 5 good weeks, then 2 bad weeks, that roller coaster that everybody thinks, well, I thought I was doing good, and then it kind of went shit again. Why is that? I don't understand. It's because we live in a polarized world, and you cease to be a leaf in the wind, as it were, in that you're not quite being thrown around randomly. You transcend randomness by virtue of bringing this divinity, I would happy to use that word, or this higher consciousness into your being. And yet still you are embedded in this very rich, multidimensional ecology of the universe. And as the sun does stuff, it will affect you. As politics make decisions, it will affect you. As your neighbour next door plays his, bassoon, it's going to affect you. As you walk outside and it's freezing cold, it's going to affect you. Everything affects us. What we're here to learn is, how do we respond to those things? And when you reach a threshold of high operation and integrity in that, then you move to the next level, which is, how do you reshape that? How do you recreate reality? Or as the New Agers like to say, how do we co-create a better joint for ourselves, a better place for ourselves? How do we do that? But you can't do that until you learn how to respond properly to what's here. That's Buddhism. See what is right in front of you, not what you'd like to see, what actually is in front of you. Face it, first of all. So the New Agers, they fall down because they don't face it. They run away from their problems and put on the white costumes and dance about. And again, not the worst crime in the world, but futile until you face what is in front of you, and then you can begin to deconstruct it.
Neil, this is Lennie, and if we're like working on, let's say, compassion, carrying compassion, the vibrancy of compassion, and we're working on, interfacing with the world through the lens of compassion, would you think that spiritual practices or other techniques like, I don't know, out-of-the-body experiences would be helpful in maintaining the conscious frequency?
There's a danger with a New Age mindset in respect to what you've just said, in that they tend to, and when I say New Age, I'm talking about the poorer examples of those kind of folks, the more woo-woo type people. So I'm caricaturing them a little bit. But let's say those kind of New Age people, when they focus on their compassion and they work on their inner self and they work on their love and they work on their unconditional acceptance of what's around them, they can easily fall foul of a rather funny irony, which is that they become very separatist in their attitudes to life, and they treat the whole world as either spiritual or not spiritual, and not spiritual people aren't worth dealing with, they might feel. And they also might feel that really they're better than people who are not working on themselves and who are not doing anything of that nature. And if you get a couple of drinks down these people's necks and talk to them about these things, I've often seen that they will admit to that very viewpoint, sometimes comically, but sometimes very seriously, which I think is disturbing. For me, I think... go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, but what about people who look at others and say, there but for mercy go you and I? I mean... not everybody who is a New Ager thinks of really themselves, everything through their personal lens, but I was really talking about looking at the world through a very compassionate, we are all, brothers and sisters together, understanding.
I'm not sure what your question is.
Oh, so that's where I was coming from. And then my question was, well, it seems to me I would be thinking my thought is that a spiritual practice like maybe a daily meditation time or like a long soaking bath where you're really contemplating is helpful to maintaining that frequency, that vibration.
Yes, it is. I'm sorry. Yeah, I recall you saying that. Yes, it is. Because if you have a sitting meditation or standing, or even like you say, you soak in the tub or whatever, that shows us something very important that in the 21st century Western world is rare, which is how to be, how to just be. And compassion has a connection to being, because when you can be purely without thinking about the past or the future, without processing, just being, sitting there, being there in an environment, compassion, I would say, flows freely, because you kind of look around and think, you know what, we're all in this together. We're all here, me, you, that guy, this lady, the cat, the dog, the ducks, the trees, the rocks, the buildings, we're all in this together. Now, you only see that from a state of peaceful being, a state of natural being. You only appreciate that, however, when that being becomes a natural part of your expression every day. It's not something you have to do. It's something that you actually feel all the time. And again, like we said earlier, that's a training thing. So yes, I do think that creating space in your life to afford yourself moments where you don't have to do anything. There's no product or service being created. You're not writing a book or writing a symphony. You're not making a chair or an application for your computer. You're not doing anything. You're just being, and there's no product or service. It's not a productive pastime, as it were. And again, that's what's so funny against the backdrop of the modern world, that that's a forbidden thing to do. Although people will talk, really in the mainstream, that's forbidden. You're not allowed to do nothing. You're not allowed to think nothing. And you're not allowed to spend much of your time doing something unproductive. That's forbidden. So being is a forbidden state. Doing is fine, and it really doesn't matter what you do. As long as you do, the mainstream paradigm, the distortion, as I call it, is happy with you. But being is a very radical expression of self, a very radical one. So soaking in the tub contains the seed of a very revolutionary spirit, in my view. And so I think, yes, it does help show you about the natural compassionate state of a spiritual man and woman, which is that they look around and think, we're all in this together, therefore there's no point in harming each other, and wouldn't it be a lot better to get along and create new stuff that's cool at every level? You only see that from a state of being. When you're doing, you tend to get drawn into your own affairs and your own indulgences, and it becomes, if you forgive the expression, a very masturbatory way of living, in that everything you're doing is for your own pleasure. And the very loveliest men and women will fall into that kind of conceit now and again, including myself and including lots of people I know. We all do it a little bit now and again. You get wrapped up in your own affairs, as I put it in the book, lost in your own narrative. But when you spot that happens, you do it less and less and less and less, to the point where when you do it, it's almost like a funny thing, and it's like slipping on a banana skin. You just think, oh gosh, that's a funny thing to do. Never mind, let's get on with it. It is very, very important to understand, and this is, a conspiratorial viewpoint, that what you do in the world is not going to be recognized in the mainstream very much. And so you have to be conscious that your spiritual unfoldment is always going to be something that at root and at the end of the day, only you yourself will fully acknowledge, appreciate, recognize, and give a certain amount of gratitude for. It's a very wonderful thing, however, that when people come along and see you and know you, that is a very beautiful thing, and people fall in love with each other by accident all the time when that happens. So if you're an insightful woman and you see a man who maybe has never been seen at his core by another human being, that man will fall in love with that woman, because it's one of the most delicious things that humans can do for each other. That follows from compassion. When you become a compassionate man or woman, you then develop this insight into each other, where you can walk into a bloody carpet shop and the lady who comes up and says, hello, is there anything I can help you with? We have a new range of carpets today. When you see that woman, she doesn't need to say anything about herself or her life or anything, and you can just think, I see you and I see your beingness in this world, and that's what happens. And then any thought of violence or aggression or silliness just is so distant, it just completely dissolves. And the more and more people who do that, it spreads this consciousness through the system, so we can achieve balance, because it's very unconscious. We need to bring a little bit more in, and that's what happens when you do this. So yeah, it's what you speak about is very important, very important.
Well, thank you.
Neil, this is Uranus Rising.
Hi.
And hi, could we speak a moment as a follow-on to the polarity about abstract art, which you wrote about in your book? And you referenced Mark Rothko and his work as an abstract expressionist. Yeah. I loved how you compared his work to that of the inner work. I thought it was stunning. And I wondered if you would expand on how abstract art can be sort of a way of moving beyond the point where forms, images, constructs no longer reflect conventional reality, and how this might reflect our spiritual growth?
Sure. Abstract art is a very, very literal and wonderful metaphor for the spiritual mindset, the spiritual journey, the conscious journey, the metaphysical journey, the mystical journey, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
Insight, essentially.
Yes.
Abstract art reflects insight because it does one very, very important thing, and you can sum everything up in this word, really: deconstruction.
Yes.
The abstract artist comes along and says, right, I want to reflect my insight into this, let us say, woman who I love,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And he says, right, number one, I'm not going to paint a woman. Number two, I'm not going to put pink blobs to recognize this shapely, beautiful woman in any way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm going to do is go to the fundamental energies that represent the way I feel, what I think, which is just as valid, and what's actually going on here at a universal level. And when an abstract artist does that, something wonderful happens. And as soon as you get over the fact that you're not going to see recognizable forms in quite the way that we're familiar with, you can walk up, and gladly we can do this all over the world now, you can walk into a gallery, stand in front of that picture, and feel, you can get a sense of what that painter was saying, much more than if the form was in front of your eyes. So it's kind of like if you have, like an electroencephalograph that plugs onto your brain and measures your brain waves. Took that graph and put it on the wall and say, right, this is erotic excitement. That's the brainwave for that. All right, this one is gentle appreciation. All right, this one is anger. And you have an inherent knowing of what those things feel and look like. What the artist is doing is just more multidimensional than that. He's saying there's intellect, there's thought, there's the abstract, of course. There's also the visceral. There's the meat and bone of life in this as well. And also the very higher, finer refinements of life. Higher, more culturally attuned aesthetics are in this as well. Very multidimensional. The bum off the street who's never seen a piece of art in his life could walk in and feel it, just the same that I can. He might not know as much about what is going on, but he feels just as much as I do or anyone else. Of course he does. We've all got the same equipment. We just use it in different ways. So the beauty of art and its relevance to the spiritual journey, which is a very old observation, but I think it's a very timely one because it's very tempting to just jettison our culture and just think, well, it's all shit, really, and it's just such a disappointment, and oh my God, the mainstream's awful. You sort of run the risk, don't you, if you do that, of throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Absolutely.
And saying, well, that's not strictly true. That's not strictly true. For example, in the sort of 70s and 80s in Britain, there was a music program on television called Top of the Pops, right?
Oh, yes, I know it.
You know that?
Yeah.
And it was like the big sort of English pop music show. And half a dozen bands would come on, play their single in front of a little live audience or mime it quite often. And then that was it. So that's all it was to it. And most of it was just the worst bilge, the worst rubbish music you've ever seen in your life. And then one day, I remember a band I was into in the late 80s, Metallica, they came on Top of the Pops and they played live on Top of the Pops, and I couldn't believe it. I just thought,
wow.
Why a Metallica on Top of the Pops? I don't understand it, because they're supposed to be cool and different and not part of the mainstream. I mean, any Metallica fan would say probably after the Black Album that changed, but that's another story. But at the time, it was just amazing. And it was like a little defining moment for the young Neil Kramer to say, you can never discount and throw stuff out, because if I'd never ever known about, alternative music of heavy metal and thrash and jazz and rock and ambient and Sybian and electronica and IDM, all these different genres, if I'd never have known them and only watched Top of the Pops, one day I'd have seen this incredible band in like 1989 or whatever on Top of the Pops. I thought, holy cow, that is so utterly different to everything else that's just stunning. So there's always things that break through into the music world, into the art world, into the Hollywood movie scene. You can't dispense with all of it and become like, an intellectual snob who says, well, I only watch, Czechoslovakian films about agriculture. That's all I watch. It's like, well, that's very nice and that sounds very good on paper, but you're missing out, baby, because there are some excellent things that pop out of the mainstream. And truth has a way, as indeed does time, of this kind of real tenacity, and it comes into every part of life, and it always will pierce through untruth eventually. You might go through periods where it certainly doesn't feel like that, like in a movie where it all looks disastrous. And then right at the end, the hero comes through and everything's okay. It's a little bit like that, I think. And certainly with art, with people like Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko and Clifford Still and many other people, they come along and say, I'm going to make a statement now. And it's not just some bizarre thing about something that's going on in my life. It's about life itself. It's about the fundamental things we all share. It's about, as we talked about earlier, compassion. It's about death. It's about love. It's about loss. It's about joyful creation. The things that absolutely bind us together. And these artists go out there like a mystic would do and pioneer and say, look, I don't really know what I'm doing here. I don't have total command over all the tools and skills, but I am taking this right from the heart with very few filters. And what you're seeing on that canvas is pretty pure. Like, Miles Davis would pick up a trumpet, and when he puts that to his lips, it's very, very pure interpretation of what's in that guy's mind. There's not a lot of layers. It's not like Christina Aguilera or Madonna, where really it's so abstracted from real human life that it's just a nice tune to shake your ass to now and again. But as to what it's saying about humanity, there's not maybe an awful lot there.
Yeah.
Whereas when a pure artist does it, operating through no other criteria other than the desire to know humankind and to make sense of the journey of human beings, when they try that and put that on a canvas 100, 200, 1,000 years later, you can still feel it. And there's nothing moving, there's no images and sounds, there's just a static snapshot of something that occurred in a human being's soul. And I think that is worthy of our exploration and our appreciation. It tells us something very important. It's also that deconstructionist element. There's no words there. There's no language there. So when you go in and look at that thing, my advice would be, anyone who's curious about doing that, try not to think about anything. Don't go in and think, stroke your chin. Now, what's he saying here? Is this about love? Is this about the rise of feminism in the 1950s? What is he, don't worry about any of that. Just go in, turn your brain down to 1 and turn your heart up to 9 and just let it flow over you and see what happens. Like standing at the ocean. You don't need to think about the ocean. We know what it bloody is. We know what it does. You can predict what it's going to do. But every time you stand in front of that ocean on the beach, put your feet in the sand, and it's a joyous thing. There's something special going on all the time, and there's no language required for it. So to break through language with art is very important at the moment in a world where language is being thrust down our throats through our phones and laptops and televisions and paid. We need to just put language aside and not look at any letters and words sometimes. Do away with all that information processing. And a lovely place to do that in the human world rather than nature, because we know where we can go in nature anywhere to do that, But in the human world, in certain art galleries, in certain buildings, with certain types of paintings in there, you can have a fantastic experience.
Mm-hmm. And I love this because I paint abstract art myself, and you've been exactly describing the process.
You must show me some pictures. I'd love to see them. Email me. I don't see them.
I will.
All right.
But what I find is that process of deconstruction, where you get rid of language, you get rid of thought, you get rid of ego, and don't have any expectations of it.
Yes.
And that's when the creativity comes, and it is moving beyond both of those polarities. It's a transmutation of energy of one form to another, which I find. And you perfectly described when you talked about the polarities of moving beyond all that. It's beyond good and evil. It's beyond black and white, inner and outer, life and death. All that's gone. So I really appreciate what you're talking about here. But also, doesn't it help us to penetrate the unconscious part of existence and explore the hidden worlds and even explore other densities and realms?
It does. It's a very spiritually sexy thing, art.
Yes.
Because it connects two opposite parts of your system, if you like. It connects your root, that red vibration, that real core vibration that you can channel through your sexuality and through your food and through your bone and sinew. And also it connects those higher aspects of one's transcendent being with the higher self and so on. And it says, there's a reason why we come here as animals who sweat and urinate and defecate and procreate and do all those amazing, wonderful, peculiar, smelly, odd things. That is a fundamental part of the journey. It's fundamentally relevant to what it is to be a human being, not just to recognize the holy journey of being a human, but to start to appreciate its significance for
and
cultivation.
Its beauty. And its beauty.
All those things, and its tremendous beauty. And the artist frees themselves from the political and the social conditioning of the day and says, to hell with all that. To hell with all that. I'm going to tell you exactly what I think about a particular subject. And because there are no words, I can get away with it. Now, if you try that as an essayist, or if you try that as a writer, most of my favorite writers and essayists have been at some point up against, a judge in a court for some obscenity or some misdemeanor or something that's conflicted with the mainstream system. Now, that does happen in art, and there are various occasions of that spring to mind, but far less frequently, because it is understood in the mainstream world that artists are a funny bunch and they do things differently, and really we don't need to take it very seriously. So that's the mainstream view. As people who bring greater and deeper consciousness into their lives, we know differently. We know that artists are to be taken sometimes just for fun. That is true. But also that some of them can be taken very deeply, very seriously. There's a lot of meaning and a lot of insight that they can convey to us about ourselves, having obviously had no relationship to us. They don't know who we are. Most of them are dead, the good ones right now. I mean, there's always some fantastic ones out there or whatever, but if you pick up a book on abstract expressionism, even one of those lovely, big coffee table type books, and if you flip through that, you're going to see amazing things that have an emotional effect. And there's no shape, there's no form, there's not men and women and babies and wardrobes and closets and iPads. There's nothing like that. It's just
A resonance?
It's a conglomeration of colour and of primary shapes. And some of those shapes are just blobs, and some of them are circles and triangles, whatever. But very, very primary shapes, like those psychological blop things that, they say, what does this look like, when you think you're going loopy. And that does create a resonance. And I would say that if the whole universe is this huge fractal entity and all pieces contain the whole, then in any painting, the whole mystery of the universe is contained. And if that's purely represented without too much analysis and cogitation, then the mirror of that fractal universe is a little clearer, and you can feel a greater truth in it. Just in the same way that if you get a super, super hologram, you're like, wow, look at that, that's incredible. And then if you get a kind of crappy one in a little store, which is just a sticker for like 50 cents, you think, well, yeah, there's an apple there or something, but it's a bit dim. The clearer the medium, then the more fidelity we have in the image. And that's what I see when I look in paintings. I think there's a lot of purity here. There's not a big gap between the mind, the paintbrush, and the canvas. They're very close. And when that happens, you as you put it, you can feel that resonance, definitely.
Yes. Oh, lovely. I love talking about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciated.
Thank you, Uranus Rising. We are speaking with Neil Kramer. You can visit his website, neilkramer.com, where you can learn more about Neil's philosophy and approach to living an authentic life. You can also find Neil's book, The Unfoldment, at all good bookstores and online retailers. Neil, we're going to move on to the topic of awakening our children and conscious parents raising children. If you could speak to that a bit. And as part of that, I want to know what your thoughts are on parents that become conscious after raising their children. And is this where we let sleeping babies sleep at that point?
Well, what a deep and controversial topic this can be. My view of it simply is that if two people can create a loving, conscious, supportive, secure space, and when I say space, I mean environment, conditions, setup, home, all those things. If they can create that space, then by all means have babies and enjoy the unique experience of being a mum or a dad. If you can't create such a space, then you shouldn't be doing it. And of course, half the planet wouldn't be here if there weren't accidental babies. So that happens. And of course, whatever. And I'm sure like half the people listening to her were, listening to this are sort of here by some sort of synchronicity, shall we say. My feelings about this, before I come straight to your question, is that, as I would put it, the control system or the old hierarchy, or those who seek to suppress natural consciousness in people, they operate very much using cultish behaviour, and I talk about this in the book. And there are certain sort of criteria for what is a cult and what is not a cult. And one of the fundamental defining characteristics of a cult is the impulse to constantly establish new members, right? Because it's kind of like a virus in that the bigger it is and the more it consumes, the more successful it is. And on the heels of that is the rather prosaic yet very important aspect of raising money. If you put those two things together, what better way than to encourage heedless, selfish procreation in your members, in your congregation? Not the sacred, conscious act of a man and woman in loving union, but a carefully calculated exercise in cult expansion. And I think that's my problem with a a world that is enormously overpopulated. And as I say in one chapter in the book, you can go to visit Africa, and you can sit with ladies who've had 20 children, and they say, well, we always have 20 children because 4 of them might survive, and we need our own tribal family for the long-term success of our lineage. And you can't really argue with that in their situation, in that condition. So there are lots of different reasons why people have children. And if you're in a place where consciousness is a luxury and a privilege, then you have to think a little bit more broadly on that. In my little exposition here, I'm talking about people with reasonable resources living in the Western paradigm, which is what I'm most familiar with. If you have all those things in place to create that loving, conscious, secure space, then having children is like one of the most astonishing things you could ever do. I can't really think of anything more magical and amazing than bringing new life forms into the world under your intimate, careful tutelage for at least 20 years. I can't think of a bigger endeavor and commitment that's possible. I think it's just amazing. I have chosen not to do that because I appreciated early on that in my life path, a lot of time and movement would be necessary to get to some of the things that I wanted to make contact with, as it were, knowledge and experiences and expansions. Having children, it wouldn't have been appropriate for me to do that, because that would mean I would be a poor father if I was doing that, because these last 20 years where I've been all over the place, I wouldn't have been there. And if I had a son or a daughter, I'd want to be there for them on a regular, consistent basis if possible. So yeah, it's not something that I do. But like anybody, I'm surrounded by friends and family with children and lots of different things, on all the different practicalities that entails. And first and foremost, I think on the spiritual journey, if you are a busy mother or father, and if you have children, whether it's 1 or 10, it doesn't matter really, that is clearly and obviously, palpably part of your teaching, part of your self-teaching, is to know what it is to be with infants and to raise people and to face all the complexities and all the conflicts of passing on your best wisdom, not passing on any woundedness, encouraging growth and individuality, balancing knowledge and truth with social interaction, and making sure the kid isn't just some weirdo who's going to get beat up at school, however clever they are, or they don't want to be just cool playing football and not being academic. You have to balance all these subtle energies as best you can, and then face the ultimate thing that every parent has to do, which is the moment when they fly the nest, when they leave, and you think, well, I've done the best that I can now, and now off they go, and they're like having sex and drinking and driving cars and doing all kinds of capers that, must drive people mad. That's an amazing thing. When I see that, I just salute mums and dads and think, wow, that's amazing. Well done, because that's hard work. I think it's very challenging to fit in deep spiritual pursuits, as it were, during that time. I think what is more appropriate for conscious parents is to say, well, rather than running around looking for the secret keys and tunneling under pyramids and going into the jungles and stuff, let me look at what's right in front of my eyes here. Let me look at this amazing family right here, right now, right in front of me, and on all the energies and all the subtle lessons that I'm going to be able to learn from what I have been part of creating. So I think if one finds oneself inescapably in the midst of a family dynamic, there's a really good reason for that. And again, like all polarities and like all energetic exchanges, it's something that you have to embrace and say, well, it might be hard, and I might secretly sometimes wish that things had been different. And yet here we are. Here we are with these babies, with these teenagers, with these young adults, whatever. here we are with my husband or my ex-husband or as a single parent or whatever. Here we are. Here is the situation as it is. And look at the growth in that situation. So even the other day, I held a small baby in my arms. And I was like, I must be getting old because I started filling up. You know, my eyes were starting to fill with tears. And it was just this extraordinary little entity in my arms. And I just thought, oh my gosh, you know, this is amazing. And I must say that 50-50 for me, life is a magical, unique, supreme creation. Yet it's very cheap and plentiful as well in other ways. And it comes and goes. And people get born and killed immediately all over the world. It's a very ephemeral thing in a way. But this entity that I held in my arms, this little baby girl, so beautiful, so amazing, it just made me think that I just thought, gosh, you've got a hell of a journey in front of you, baby. You know, this is 85 years, maybe, whatever the average lifespan is. You have got one hell of a fascinating journey. And not only that, but you're at an infant stage of being one or whatever. There's all these huge changes going on in the world, enormous shifts, paradigms cracking in half and falling open and spilling their innards all over the place. And here is this little girl, completely oblivious to that, and being pure in her being in a way that I cannot be in my being. She, without much knowledge locally in her little brain, is exercising a refined state of being that escapes me. I can't do it. And so I watch her and think, what is it that you're doing? Is it just absence of knowledge and an absence of social conditioning? Are you connected? Are you field uplinking all the time? Is that the natural state? Does it mean that if you're constantly linked to the field, to the 4D where all knowledge exists, the Akashic field, whatever you want to call it, is it therefore unnecessary to have local downloads in your own brain of books you've read and things you know? Is that unnecessary because you're permanently Wi-Fi'd up to a higher dimension as a baby? Is that how it works? So, you know, what things this little entity can teach me just by looking at and just loving her, you know, just loving her as somebody that I don't have any articulate or eloquent or socially responsive relationship with. And yet there she is with a little finger, you know, in the classic way, a little hand going around my finger, you know, and you feel like a giant.
Yes.
And just feeling a little heartbeat and, you know, a little mouth. And it's just amazing. And yet everyone knows what this is. And everyone's thinking, yeah, we've seen that. Yeah, we know what you're talking about. But when you really, really look at what that is, it's astonishing. So to have that in your life for a couple of decades while you go through that raising children period is one of the most important spiritual teachings. I feel that I've done that several times, and it's something that I have gone through, I've loved, I've appreciated, I've broken my heart, I've mended my heart, I've grown, I've lost, all the things that parents go through. I think I've kind of done that. I feel that and see that when I look at little kids and think, I know that, but not here, not in this life as this man, but I know that. I feel that I know it. What's then interesting is that after that 20-year period, because really I think that's when you're really, you know, solidly being a parent on a consistent basis, when that's changing, I mean, you know that obviously as long as they're alive, you're always responsible in some way. And my personal view of this is that if you have children, you owe those children everything for the rest of their lives, the rest of your life at least. You owe them everything, and they owe you nothing. And I think that's a very powerful thing that I feel with children and parents. That's a whole other issue. As to the question of what happens when they're kind of grown up and they're working or they're at university and they're beginning to lead their own lives, then amazing things happen in people's lives. I meet a lot of women about the age of 50 who are suddenly like spiritual ninjas all over the place with tremendous speed and penetration and enthusiasm. And their mothers, they have had children, and suddenly they've reached this point in their life where, oh my gosh, look at this girl go, you know, and they put a lot of the guys to shame, really. And it makes me think that, contrary to some Mesoamerican shamanic traditions who, you know, largely exclude women who've had children, I don't see that. I don't see the evidence for that. I see women maintain this spark of knowingness and this compulsion for inquiry into life's mystery, completely retained from infancy to old age. It never really goes anywhere. In men, I would say, at about the age of 25, it's usually snuffed out and doesn't come back. Okay? They might lead the whole life in ignorance, die, and then come back again as someone else and start to reignite that, as it were. It never really goes out. You can't really extinguish yourself at all, no matter how many times you might try. I don't think it works like that. But for women, to put it in plain talk, they stay open-minded for longer. And men tend to want to seek closure on things as fast as possible, in a political sense, in an emotional sense, in a sexual sense, in an intellectual capacity, all those things. Men are taught to say, look, you need to know what you're about, where you're doing, and what you're going to be achieving, really, as a young man, and then, you know, put that in stone and keep it that way. Spiritual men, a bit different. Obviously, they have that feminine energy flowing a bit more freely and powerfully in them, where those things are softened, and you think, well, it's a moving target. It's all subject to change. We can't just say, this is me and this is what I do. And the frequency and character of midlife crisis in men, I have noticed, is changing now, in that it's not quite as stark and stupid as it used to be. So, as I've said before, you know, in the 70s and 80s, a guy would get to 40 or 50 and think, what the hell am I doing with my life? This is rubbish. And then he goes out and gets a sports car and has sex and gets drunk and, you know, throws a brick through the window or something. I don't know. Does some bizarre stuff as a kind of primal reaction against the drabness of what he thought should be fulfilling. A crap life, basically, in a crap job with a crap relationship. And what on earth do you do about that? Well, I think today, from the 90s and the 2000s and up to where we are now, that's begun to change. And the people who are hitting the midlife crisis zone in the 40s and 50s and earlier as well, it's more of an awakening rather than a collapsing, and people are actually doing something about it. So they're making calculated strategic changes with more depth and more consistency and more substance. So they're not just freaking out and then going back to normal again. They're actually doing something different and changing it. The number of like accountants and doctors and attorneys that I've met who are saying, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. It looks very good and I made some nice money, and everybody gives me this respect for having this so-called profession, but it's not really what I want to do. And maybe it never was. The number of people I've met who've said that to my face privately is astonishing. And I think that no matter how sexy and brilliant and well rewarded financially a job is, if it's not fulfilling, it fundamentally fails all men and women. And that is becoming less accepted in mainstream society now. So people are starting to say that Thatcher, Reagan materialism is bullshit in a very, very profound way, and we're not buying it anymore. And it's only like very, very right-wing people who really still feel that way, you know, like Sean Hannity type people. And I think that's laughable and funny and disturbing all at the same time, but that is going away. That is changing.
Is there anything that you have run into that can speed that up at all?
I think one of the most important things is something very simple, which even you guys might be starting to become accustomed to or even take for granted now, which is community, where you know that you could pick up the phone to one of these excellent people on the line now and say, hey, you know what? I'm just going through a bit of a tricky time at the moment. I just wondered if I could talk to you a little bit. The ability to do that with someone who gets it is very powerful and very, very important. And it's key that we recognize that tribalism, if you like, in a good sense, that community, if you have that, you don't take as many stupid wrong turns. And when you do need to share, you can do it not just with someone who will say, oh, that's a shame. Well, we all go through that and it passes. And they won't just offer you rubbish platitudes like that.
Right.
They will actually say, yeah, I get that. That happened to me and that happened to my friend and this is what I did. And these are some mistakes I made. But this is something that I learned as well that, I'd love to share with you, see what you think about this.
Yeah.
The ability to speak to people, conscious people who are older than you and wiser than you, or who are younger than you and freer than you, darker, lighter, the full spectrum of people who've been through it 10 times worse than you, and people who have tremendous compassion, as we were talking about earlier. We just sort of know that bringing our sensitivity up to a new level will create some pain, definitely. It will kind of heat up the struggle a little bit. Most of the time, it creates such extraordinary beauty, though, that it just eclipses that stuff. But when those weird, dark nights come along, the knowledge that you can, if you want to, make contact with somebody, even better, of course, face-to-face, and say, you know what, I'd really like to talk at the moment. There's a few things going on. I'd really, really like to just share that. Most people don't have that. In the mainstream world, most people do not have that at all. I don't care if they're in a church, a society, a big family, they don't have it. And the reason they don't have it is because there aren't many conscious people in that paradigm, in any mainstream paradigm, any church. There are not many conscious people. There aren't. And I think it's tough to argue against that nowadays.
Yeah.
If you have purposefully focused your consciousness on connecting and networking in a positive, natural way with other people who have made it their business to become conscious and true and pure and compassionate and powerful, then it's an enormous difference between the mainstream ignorant mindset, which is a choice, by the way. That's a choice to be ignorant.
Right.
People who have chosen no longer to be ignorant and break that old pattern. What a massive difference it is to talk about your marriage or your bankruptcy or your cancer or your dreams or your future hopes for your, graphic design business or your artisan vegetable shop or whatever the hell it is. Right. We all have things diminishing, growing, becoming lighter, becoming darker in our lives at any one time. To be able to sit with somebody who you have faith in and talk to that person and get real ear to what you're saying, so they actually listen to what you're saying, and where given and where asked for, there is intelligent, insightful response. I think that accelerates that process. That is a very important thing as well.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. Some of the most incredible touches of that divinity have been in listening to someone live their life out in front of you.
Yeah.
However sad or however joyous it is. I mean, that immediacy of connection is such a blessing, a curse. It's an immediacy.
It is, and it's like we were saying before. As you develop natural insight in your waking day-to-day life, and your sleeping day-to-day life, if you really go long and hard at it, you do feel that, well, essentially we're all in the same boat. We're all kind of here. Nobody knows what the hell's going on. We do our best. We try and be an asset to each other and ourselves, and that's it. That's all we can say for sure. And in that environment, one's willingness to share great intimacies about oneself in a confidential environment, which I think is appropriate, to share great intimacies about yourself with someone else is a very powerful act. And there's no trust required there, because you don't need to trust anyone. You just say it.
Right.
And that's all that you have to do. And we don't need trust when we have this tremendous faith in ourselves and in each other. It's a different thing. Trust is like, will they say anything to anyone else? Doesn't really matter. Because conscious people, if they do, they'll choose that wisely to say that. And if someone's a blabbermouth, maybe you'll spot that and not say anything. But it doesn't really matter. So the old things of going to a therapist to suggest this, or a professional, they're not really going to help an esoteric viewpoint. They're not really going to have any grounding unless they're like totally unique and unusual about sacred texts, about broad spiritual comparative mythology awareness. They probably won't have that. So a lot of our reference points, you're not going to be able to check those in with that person. So my greatest therapists, my greatest teachers are just totally, totally normal people down the street who just have a wise view, plain speaking sometimes, and then at other times, very eloquent, deep thinkers. It's joyful to speak to those people. But really, plain speaking people with an open heart can tell you more about yourself than anyone else.
Yeah. And it's surprising when they do.
Yes, it is.
Surprising and healing.
Yep.
Neil, since we're on this about healing and woundedness, our woundings may be personal things that have happened to us, but I've seen over and over again that they might be a familial or generational or even cultural wound. But isn't everything personal in the end, in that this is the best way to approach it, as if even if it's cultural, we have to heal it within ourselves?
Yeah, I think so. And in my work with people, very often people will say, okay, I've got this wound or this negative pattern or this hang-up or this baggage, whatever we want to call it, and I'm aware of it, and I've known about it for a long time, and I just can't seem to do anything about it. I can't shake it. It's still restricting me. And it's usually something pretty deep and influences somebody's behavior or ability to expansively express themselves. It impedes that natural flow of energy. My formulation of what to do about this, the first thing is to say, being conscious of your hang-ups and your negative patterning isn't enough. You can be absolutely precisely aware of all the details of where you've gone wrong, of bad habits you've got, of negative perspectives you've got about yourself, your self-esteem, your self-worth, and nothing will change.
Right.
Nothing at all will change. Being aware of a thing is not enough. And many people continue to make mistakes on that. They miscalculate and think that greater awareness will make the problem go away. It doesn't change a damned thing. Not at all. And so many times I've seen this happen now, it's not even funny. But what I can say is that my formulation for, well, what do we do then? You have to locate it. And when I say locate, you have to understand where is the inception point of that negative pattern. So,
is this the tracing back you wrote about in the book?
Yeah, it is. And it's like, I've never really seen anybody with a root deep problem that occurred after the age of about 14. I've never, ever known that, ever. And I'm not a medical professional, and I don't pretend to be. I'm speaking purely from a conscious angle here. Most of the time, most people's issues, the root of them stems from 1 to 7 years of age or 0 to 7 years of age.
Yeah,
And
I'd agree with that.
Yeah, and even if you can say, well, there was something that happened in high school when I was 16, it was really unpleasant. I'm sure that kind of messed loads of things up, even into my 30s and 50s and 70s or whatever. Maybe so, but 9 times out of 10, if you go back to that event, that was a reflection again of a previous wounding, as it were, like some traumatic event that happened. And in the book, I give an example. You know, obviously, if you're going to be subject to like awful abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, any kind of abuse is just hideous, unthinkable in my world. Anyone who's been subject to that is obviously going to experience trauma. Equally, though, there are other kinds of trauma, which some people might think, well, these are not as bad. Shock traumas of like emotional inadequacy, or making a mistake, or, you know, feeling a tremendous amount of guilt about something that one has done wrong. Or, as I say in the book, there's just a very simple affair with this guy who, his mother one day at the table said that he was an accident at birth.
Yeah, that's dreadful.
I know. And it's funny we mentioned that in this conversation, but this guy basically went around treating women like dirt for his whole life because of that 20-second comment at the dinner table when he was a young man with his mother. And that was a massive, massive wounding that affected him through his teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, all the time. And he's been unable to form a consistent relationship with a woman. So is that a less dramatic and visceral wounding than sexual abuse? Yes, it is. Does it have the same deep effects as that? Yes, it does. So the character of the initial wound can be misleading in that even though it was just a throwaway comment, if you're tuned very sensitively, a wrong word can send you into the madhouse, as it were, into the loony bin. Just like a smell can, or a piece of music, or somebody wearing a dress that looks like the dress when something weird happened once. So these things are going to happen. These things are going to occur. So we have to locate as far as possible where that came from. And obviously, if we're really, really young, you have to develop some kind of regressive technique to get back to that. You can do it in dream work very organically. You can do it in meditation, but it's kind of, you know, a real feat that I've only seen it a half a dozen times. You can do it in hypnotism. You know, you can get a professional hypnotherapist to help you with that, and you can locate what it was. Then you articulate it. So then you begin to articulate what it is, and you write it down, you say it out loud, you spell it out, you own it. So the articulation is accepting responsibility and saying, yep, that happened. I was there, that happened, this is what happened. Let me precisely detail what happened. Once you've done that, you can then contrast that to where you're at now and redesign that bad wiring, as it were, and say, well, what used to happen was this big guy with red hair beat the shit out of me when I was 7. And ever since then, I've always bullied people with red hair. And whenever I see them in the street, I laugh and spit at them. And once we kicked the shit out of this guy at a train station, you know, me and my drunk friends, just because he had red hair. And now I can see the connection. So you redesign it and say, well, first of all, that's not any way to behave anymore, because you don't need to do it. You can completely stop doing that right now. And the way you're doing it, the way you do that is with what I would call a live experiment. You experiment with the new wiring. You can't just fix the new wiring in place and say, right, from now on, I will treat all red-haired people equally. You can't do that. You have to experiment with it first and run with that and see what happens. So it's a bit like saying, like I was talking to a lady last week about this. If you go into like a cafe or a restaurant or a diner, and you know when you walk in there, there's like obviously 3 or 4 tables that are really excellent places to sit. You know, the booths in the corner or whatever, right?
Right.
And then there's obviously some places that are the worst tables to sit, like right in the middle. You know, no sort of good feng shui about them, and it's just nobody wants to sit in them. They're the last tables to get filled. if you thrust yourself into that table and say, I am purposefully going to sit at the worst table in this restaurant and enjoy it, then you begin to rewire something in your brain. And if you do that 10 times, every single table in the restaurant is okay from that point onwards.
Yeah.
And that's a very funny, simple example of how it works. And I've experimented with that. And there's something very instructive in there for more serious matters that is worth knowing about. And it affects everything we do, especially in terms of our self-worth and self-confidence, to say, I can create an excellent situation for myself and have a brilliant relationship with somebody and live in a nice place and eat quality food and make the journeys and the experiences that I want. I can create a life where that happens. I'm good enough for that to be the case. And I might not fully know where all that stuff's going to come from or who that person is or what resources are going to be necessary to finance some of this stuff. But fundamentally, when you realize that you can do whatever you need to do and that what you're doing is supporting growth, not only in repairing yourself, but as we've said a number of times already really here, when we repair ourselves, we repair the universe. When you do that, the universe cuts your brakes on that stuff and says, right, I'm going to make sure you meet that guy and I'm going to make sure you meet that woman and that $2,000 you need for this. I'm going to provide that to you in an unexpected way. And it starts to support what you're doing. And the more conscious you are of that dynamic, the more that support is tangible. Sometimes it's just psychological support, and sometimes that's enough. Other times when you need that, lemon in your hand, 5 minutes later there's a lemon in your hand, then you think, wow, that's very physical. But the only difference really is the sort of density of that manifestation. So in a way, giving somebody emotional support is exactly the same as giving them a bloody piece of fruit in the hand. It's the same thing. It's just a different oscillation of energy in a way. So I think that with this, locate it, articulate it, redesign it, and then experiment live with the new wiring, and say, right, from now on, I'm not going to dislike Catholics. I'm not going to think that Subarus are the best cars in the world. I'm not going to never wear red trousers. Whatever.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm making kind of humorous points, but you can experiment with a safe subject matter, a safe thing to do, and see how that actually physically changes the neural pathways in your mind, in your brain, in your computer. I've talked about this a couple of years ago. They have this thing called DTI imaging, where it images the neural pathways in the brain, the circuitry in the brain essentially for certain activities. And when you start to, for example, learn to write with the opposite hand, so if you're right-handed, if you learn to write with your left hand, you physically change the wiring in your brain, and they can measure this now.
Yes,
so,
yes.
Actually, you are physically changing the pathways in your brain. It's the energy, the consciousness, the juice is running down different pathways. So we're not really even speaking metaphorically when we say rewire. I mean rewire.
Oh, I know. Yes, you create whole new synapses in the brain.
That's right.
And so your mind is thinking totally differently.
That's right. And sometimes we need help with this support. Sometimes you cannot do it on your own. So if you have a deep wound, a deep psychological wound, which was a response to something that happened a long time ago, and you can't even remember the details of it, or they're sketchy, or it's too hard or weird to go there anyway, sometimes you need help with that. And you need to find the right person to do that. So not all of these things can be done on their own. Some things require allies, sometimes human beings, sometimes plants, sometimes other types of entities, whatever. Don't want to get too esoteric, but help, basically. That's what we're talking about, helping each other in these scenarios.
Yeah. Well, Neil, is the healing of our wounds really about asking, what do we have to gain by being attached to them? and then letting go of that attachment?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's funny that a lot of people, where you delineate what the wound is and how they're negatively responding to that and how that's restricting their life, when faced with that, they'll think, well, whatever, I'm still going to keep it. Many people choose a state of woundedness rather than a state of freedom and of total well-being. And that, again, has been a surprise for me. I'm sure a psychologist could have told me that 20 years ago. But personally, in my own experience, that has been a big surprise. The martyrdom syndrome, I think of it as, where people will prefer to walk around under the burden of their crucifix, their very own personal crucifix on their back, and struggle around with that, rather than live as powerful, free human beings. The reason for that is that you have to take ownership for your own well-being. Mm-hmm. And many people do not want to take ownership of anything, not even their own freedom. They don't want to do it. They'd rather characterize themselves and articulate their narrative by a negative thing, to say, well, look at the burden I carry. Look at poor me. Pity me. Mercy. Have mercy. Look at how good I am under this tremendous suffering. People do that the world over in all different demographics, rich people, poor, black, white, whatever. Loads of people do that, and it's just astonishing. And it took me a while to get to it, but it's an issue for me that I see. It's an issue of ownership, in that you don't have to own your own divinity and your own created life if you are carrying your own crucifix, if you are living in a state of voluntary woundedness. So that is a problem, facing people with that. Yeah,
but sometimes I've noticed too that, say, somebody has had a terrible mother or something and have issues with other women as they, go into adulthood. I found that sometimes the reason that they keep that attachment is that was their only connection with their mother. And so in order to let go of that attachment, they then have to let go of their only connection with their mother at that point.
Yeah, so that's a nice observation that I try and talk about in the book as well. And that's very true. People do think, well, if I stop hating my mother, to use your example, then I lose any connection I had with my mother. So although it's a negative connection, it's still a connection.
Right. And it's like the bad child, they get attention, but it's better than no attention.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that, again, is part of the redesign process in my little formulation, to say, just if you're making a miscalculation if you think that by not hating your mother anymore, you're actually taking something away from the memory of that woman, and you're breaking a connection to that one. That's a miscalculation, all right? It's understandable, but it's a miscalculation. Yeah. If you can then sit with that person and redesign a more appropriate response and say, well, first of all, that wound that she created in you through whatever, neglect or violence or whatever, let us see if we can trace where that came from. And then through conversation, you realize that her mother also neglected her. Right. You think, well, it's funny, isn't it? Because this wound is essentially, it's like pass the parcel. It's being passed from one generation to the next. Yes. And it's like a negative cycle, and you just keep passing it and passing it and passing it. So this is why it's such a valid thing to say healing yourself is a very generous thing to do, because you stop passing that on then. You say, with me, that negative patterning stops right now, right here with me. I'm not doing that anymore. And you fix it. You don't only fix yourself, you fix a massive negative resonance that would have gone on for, who knows, hundreds, thousands of years. Yeah.
Yes.
So
healing the ancestors.
You do. And there is some esoteric principle in this as well, which suggests that not only do you heal it forwards, but you also heal it backwards.
Yes, I totally agree. And I've even seen where wounds will skip several generations until you have a circuit breaker, I like to call them, come in that incarnates in.
Yeah.
That breaks these dynamics that have been going on for who knows how many generations.
I totally agree, and it's very clear when you see certain people who bring that bad patterning to an end. You can look at that person and think, you were the perfect person for that. It's
Yes.
like, this has been a very tremendous challenge. There's no doubt about that. But what a beautiful gift as well.
Yes.
And what an enormous skill the person brings up in themselves and then can share and transmit to their friends and families when they go through.
And an honor it is to do so, too, on behalf of
Well, that's a
others.
very high viewpoint, but you're absolutely right. It is an honor to be involved in such challenges. To be a circuit breaker is an honor. But when someone's in the thick of it, try telling them that. It doesn't feel like much of an honor until afterwards. But you're right, it is an honor because one places oneself in a very solemn and powerful situation where you might be touching thousands and thousands of lives at a very, very personal and intimate level. And it's a great responsibility in a way. And if you're chosen, in quotes, to do that by choosing yourself to do that, then you take on this mantle of healing, and wow, it's a huge voluntary act of a lot of hard work just to behave in a fluid and normal way. That's what you get out of it. So you get your little reward, but what it does to those in the environment is enormous, enormously beneficial.
Yes. Wonderful, Neil. Thank you for that. Much appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
Neil, I was really interested in the chapter in your book, Ogres Bearing Gifts, and how our challengers are also our teachers. And along those same lines, if you could speak to that, what a blessing they end up being. Do ogres present gifts that are experienced collectively, or are they always personal gifts?
Well, is it personal? Is it collective? Is it archetypal? Is it everybody's? Is it nobody's? Depends from what perspective you're looking at. If you are sat in an office with a very annoying person, which if you read my book, you'll see a funny story about that. That feels pretty personal. I'm there. It's me. I'm experiencing it. It's personal. So from that perspective, yes, it is personal. Have we ever heard other stories about other people being marooned with annoying or negative people? Yes, we hear it all the time. In fact, it's conspicuous by its popularity and its commonality, that story, isn't it? There's always somebody at the party spoiling it, in other words. There's always somebody who is making life difficult for everybody else. And again, isn't it funny how conspicuously common is that? And you start to look at this as a detective, if you like, and think, hang on a second, the profile of these situations, there's one thing that they all share, and that you get a certain number of people together in a business or in a party or in a family or in a this or that. There's always like one obviously destructive or annoying or negative person thrown in that mix, right? Always. That's unusual. And so when you look at that, when I started to look at that and notice it, it's like, again, it's the universe making sure that that dynamic of positive, negative is constantly applied and constantly observed. So the answer is, yes, it is personal. It is also collective in that we all experience it. We all experience it. And it's also kind of an archetype. So if you were to zoom out several levels and say, well, let's say there's one archetypal annoying person who is always going to spoil the party. There's only one. There's only one archetype. And each person who does that resonates that archetype. It's a way of thinking about it, that. So what you're doing is you're refining that energy. You're separating it out from the individual and saying, well, let's not name the names of the people. Let's not worry about the cultural characteristics of that. But let's define what that annoyance is. what that spoiling of the party is, what that achieves, what that ultimately teaches people. And when you do, again, you cannot help but say, it might be an ogre bringing you this thing, but what they hold in their hands is a gift, and it's a gift of knowing, and it's a gift of not rejecting negativity outright, and it's a gift of not discarding negative experiences in favor of only positive ones. People who do that lose out on half of life. And it's also a very important lesson, again, in this thing we call compassion, of not rejecting or disregarding our fellow men and women who are in places of pain. So if you get a person who's behaving badly, there's only one reason people do that. Only one reason. They are in pain. They are in some sort of psychic disturbance. And think about when that might have happened to you as a young man or woman. You probably did some stupid stuff, inconsiderate, destructive things, because there was some sort of pain. And it's no different whether it's some big, huge gangster, villain type person, or whether it's a bully in the playground in the schoolyard, or whether it's a violent husband, or whether it's a, promiscuous woman, or whatever. It doesn't matter. All these funny role types that we see, archetypally studied into movies and dramas and TV shows. We see those things there for a reason, because they are archetypes. But when you start to deconstruct them, they're archetypes of certain roles that people fall into when a certain pain threshold is reached. So you can immediately reframe what it is when you encounter one of these people and think, you're somebody in pain, and you're being presented to me, and I'm being presented to you. And there is the potential here for a transaction, for me to learn and for you to lose the pain. Now, can we do those two things at the same time with a smile on our face and actually achieve something here, or what? And that's the transaction put forth in many of those situations. So a lot of what I talk about in the unfoldment is a reframing of things we think we knew, because you just think, well, that person's a dick and it'd be better if they just left, or I'll move because they're so annoying, I'll get a different job and move where that person isn't. But you tend to find when we do that, that person shows up in a different guise as a different individual somewhere else. And it happens over and over and over. So, as people who listen to me often will have heard me say, you can't escape these things in life, these lessons. The universe will present them to you over and over and over until not only you face them, but you resolve them and see them for what they are and find the nugget, as it were, within that negative experience and think, well, this is unpleasant. This is a struggle. It's not really what, I want to do particularly. And yet it's part of the training exercise. It's an assault course. It's boot camp here. It's not a vacation. It's not meant to be all blissed out and wonderful all the time. That's not much training, really. It's supposed to be a struggle. And when you realize that, you can then begin to reframe what struggle is. What is struggle? Struggle is challenge. What is challenge? Challenge is an opportunity for something. An opportunity for what? To cultivate your soul, to actually create a vessel that has an eternal aspect. Because we have spirit, which is eternal, and you cannot fundamentally get rid of that. So you're always going to go home in the end. But we don't come in with a soul. You have to build that. And you build that through walking the path, through experience. There's no surrogate for that. There's no substitute for that. You have to build it yourself. And that's why all of these situations, all of these challenges are actually kind of quite juicy. And the smart student will be like, oh, great, another challenge. And when the smart student hears of somebody's life who is just like, oh, yeah, quiet, easy, straightforward, you think, oh, that's a shame. That's a terrible shame. Because obviously you are not going to all the classes. You are not throwing yourself into the juice of life. You are standing against, the border, the sidelines, just peering in from a distance, not really participating, which is okay. You can do that as long as you like. But the longer you do that, the longer you'll be here. And if secretly you're sort of ready to graduate, ready to ascend, ready to go on to the next adventure, then you've got to get involved.
Thank you, Neil. Neil's book is The Unfoldment, and we appreciate you being here with us this evening, Neil. And you have a workshop coming up in August.
I do. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I have a workshop called Unfoldment, Secrets and Synchronicity. It's like a sort of 2-day workshop, really. That's on August the 25th, and that's over at the East Setty Ranch in Trout Lake, which is just near Hood River in Oregon. So anybody roughly in the area or anyone who can travel over, would love to see you there. It's going to be a brilliant weekend, lots of interesting things to do, lots of brilliant people. A lot of the things we've talked about on this program tonight in terms of sharing, conversation, communion, those things happen at these sort of events. So yes, I get on the stage and talk about stuff for a bit, but outside of that, there's lots of amazing things that occur. So if you can get along to that, please, I'd love to see you there.
Oh, we'd love to be there, no doubt. And we hope you'll join us again another time, Neil. And it's always a pleasure having you on Time Monk Radio. Our executive producer is Fox, and he provided the recording and technical support of our show tonight. And you can listen to more Time Monk Radio interviews at timemonkradio.com, Time Monk's Radio Facebook page, and on YouTube. On behalf of all of us at Time Monk Radio, be well.